How to be a winner. Coach yourself to success. Fulfill your potential. Yes, you can achieve your dreams. Now, those are all titles of popular self-help books, and perhaps also mantras of our contemporary era. While the self-loathing grumble, I just don't feel I've achieved anything with my life, has become an increasingly common refrain on the sofas of both loved ones and therapists. The language of success and failure, it seems, is everywhere around us. And I imagine that most of you, most of the people that we all know, probably want to be a success or an achiever in some sense of the term. It might be academically, it might be musically, maybe it's about being a really good dad or being the best possible big sister. We want to date people with ambition and goals. Certainly don't want to be sharing our life with some loser. And we want our future children, if we're thinking of having them, to achieve as much as they can. These are ideas that feel very familiar to us. And they're not just concerns for us here in the United Kingdom. Nation states around the world, and you see here an example from Vietnam, are racing to make their populations globally competitive and to attract international investment in the knowledge industries. And as they're doing so, ever more human beings are being told how important it is to be motivated, hardworking, and ultimately successful. But is this elusive category that we refer to as achievement really our ticket to prosperity and well-being? Well, obviously it sometimes can be. I'm not going to sit here and pretend it wouldn't be amazing to win the X Factor or The Voice. Probably a bit more amazing to win the X Factor than The Voice. But if we zoom out a bit and we look at the bigger picture, things start to get a bit more complicated, because doing well is not always everything that it's cracked up to be. But why not? Now, that might not at first sight seem like a particularly anthropological question. It's quite abstract. But I hope that over the course of this taster lecture, I'm going to be able to convince you that it is an important anthropological question. And in doing so, give you a flavour of some of the really important work that anthropologists have been doing to try and understand and improve levels of mental health and quality of life in societies around the world. And our story begins in New York, the quintessential city of achievement. When Frank Sinatra sang that if he could make it there, he'd make it anywhere, he did so to the swaggering sound of a full brass band. His lyrics told us that achieving pointed to an innate capacity of the self, one that could be used to make it anywhere, while the trumpets told us that was going to feel fantastic. But some little town blues don't melt away so easily. When the American playwright Tennessee Williams, who'd striven for years to make it as a stage success, finally won critical acclaim for his play The Glass Menagerie, he quickly fell into a terrible despair. He described himself as suffering a sense of spiritual dislocation, became sick at the sight of his Manhattan hotel room, felt so removed from the world that he could no longer taste the difference between the chocolate sauce and the gravy on his room service tray. A well of cynicism rose in me, he wrote. Conversations all sounded like they'd been recorded years ago and were being played back on a turntable. Sincerity and kindliness seemed to have gone out of my friends' voices. I suspected them of hypocrisy. I stopped calling them. I stopped seeing them. And Williams later described this experience as the catastrophe of success. But why should success be a catastrophe? How can we understand such an extreme negative reaction to what ought to have been a happy development? Well, one line of explanation, what I would describe as a biomedical approach, would focus on Williams as a clinical individual. And certainly if we look at the case with current medical knowledge in mind, then his symptoms, the extreme social withdrawal, the paranoia, even the sensorial disengagement with the sights and flavours of the world, would all seem to be the hallmarks of a clinical depression. And so we could very easily argue that this catastrophe of success reflected a particular depressive episode underpinned by an imbalance in his brain chemistry. And we might even speculate that there was some other kind of underlying mechanism. Maybe there was some kind of inherited set of genes or aspect of his childhood development that rendered Williams particularly susceptible to a depressive episode. Now, those kinds of individualizing biomedical explanations would not be wrong, and there's a lot of very important work being done into the biological and developmental dimensions of mental illness, and that's incredibly important in developing better treatments and understanding what we're dealing with. But I think there are some aspects of the case that this biomedical approach simply can't answer. Because even if Williams, let's say, was genetically predisposed to depression, why should it have been the fact that his play did well that served as the trigger for his breakdown? And that question becomes all the more interesting when one discovers that experiencing a depressive episode in the wake of a success is actually a relatively common occurrence in Europe, in America, and increasingly in other parts of the world as well. Could it be that there's something intrinsic to success that gives it a high likelihood of triggering mental anguish? Quite possibly. But that's not something we can understand properly without a thorough inquiry into what success means to the people that experience it in a given place at a particular time. It's because of that meaning of success, which is ultimately a socio-cultural rather than biomedical phenomenon, that the condition develops. And so we need to add a socio-cultural perspective to our analysis if we're to fully understand what we're dealing with. So that's one important contribution that an anthropological approach to mental health can provide. But there's also another one, because when you first hear of someone wanting to pull away from others and shut down, growing tired of the things that they used to enjoy, it seems like such a classic case of depression that the diagnosis is pretty straightforward. But are we then at risk of imposing our own categories of mental illness onto another time and place? Now, at the time, and this occurred in the 1940s, Williams was not diagnosed with depression, but with a disease called neurasthenia, a condition that no longer exists in Western psychiatry, but which at the time was so common that the word neurasthenia was said to be as widely known as the word bicycle. So, in other words, it was a condition that was as well known as depression and stress and anxiety are today. So what happened to it? Did we just discover that neurasthenia was depression all along? Or could it be that neurasthenia and depression are actually two different, if similar, disorders, each specific to a particular place and time? And if so, what is it about the world that we live in now that's causing depression to be on the rise and neurasthenia to have disappeared? Now, these aren't questions that can be answered by biomedical perspectives alone either. Instead, they ask us to explore how the biochemical and anatomical dimensions of our brains interface with the social and cultural world that those brains are constantly engaging with. And anthropology, as a discipline that's concerned with all aspects of human being, can offer some really helpful perspectives for thinking about these difficult issues, the nature of psychiatry, the nature of experience, these big conceptual issues that get raised by one singular example, one singular puzzle of the catastrophe of success. And so that's what I'm going to turn to in the remainder of the talk. Now, for me, probably the most fundamental question that underpins our exploration today is that of whether categories of mental illness exist universally, affecting all human beings in all societies, or whether they vary cross-culturally, reflecting the fact that different cultures have got different concepts of the self, of the emotions, and of the mind. Now, as you might imagine, this has been a subject of tremendous debate amongst anthropologists, and there's still disagreement about it. But I would say that the current consensus generally goes something like this. It seems that in all societies, people can suffer debilitating feelings of sadness, hopelessness, or dissatisfaction with the things of the world, including their social relationships. All things that we associate with depression. And this very general kind of experience does seem to be cross-culturally universal, and that has been referred to by the term dysphoria. And it seems that a propensity for dysphoria is something that all human beings in all societies share. However, there can be tremendous variation in how that dysphoria is expressed, described, and experienced. And here it seems that culture and social organisation does play a huge role. So, for example, in the West, we have a condition known as depression, which is typically associated with a very particular cluster of symptoms. One feels, well, depressed, pushed down on, suffocated, lacking in energy and motivation, low. And these are ideas that have slipped into popular parlance as well. And if I wake up and say, I'm feeling a bit depressed today, it's not necessarily a clinical diagnosis, but it's a reference to my mood, my energy levels, my general feelings. But elsewhere, different symptoms of dysphoria stand out. So in parts of West Africa, sufferers of dysphoria commonly describe their condition in terms of physical symptoms, a sense that ants are crawling around in the brain, or that someone has put pepper inside the head. In Mexico, dysphoria is described as a sensation that the brain is exploding. Now, these aren't especially common ways of reporting dysphoria in the UK or the USA. In fact, the idea of there being ants in the brain, for example, is something that British doctors would normally associate with a delusional disorder or a psychosis rather than with dysphoria. So even if biomedically the same kind of chemical imbalance is affecting the body in all of these different examples, the actually experienced illness is very different, or at least it's attended to differently and narrated differently, because a lot of depressed people in Britain also suffer from headaches, but those headaches haven't become a prominent part of the way that our society imagines the classic symptoms of depression. So what then is it about contemporary Western societies that makes the concept of depression as we know it such a compelling way of articulating the dysphoria that human beings anywhere and everywhere are prone to suffer? Why did depression only really take off as a recognised disorder in the 1970s? And why was the concept of neurasthenia so much more popular beforehand? These are the kinds of questions that we now have to think about. If we recognise that things are variable, why are they varying in the particular ways that they do? So to get to grips with those questions, let's take a closer look at the similarities and differences between neurasthenia and depression. Now, neurasthenia, often described as a disease of the nerves, from which we get the term nervous breakdown, did include feelings of sadness and fatigue and depression amongst its symptoms, but they weren't prioritised. Equally, if not more important, were feelings of anxiety and neuralgia, or nerve pain. And it's quite interesting because that nerve pain might not be so very different from the feeling of having ants or pepper in the head. Tennessee Williams himself described his struggle with neurasthenia as like having wild cats under his skin. So physical pain, anxious feelings, and a sense of low mood all combined equally in the condition of neurasthenia. What changed in the transition to depression was that the feelings of low mood, fatigue, and social withdrawal came to take centre stage, both in how doctors imagined mental illness, in the public imagination of mental illness, and even in the symptoms that patients reported. So what could have led to this kind of shift? Well, I think there are two big factors that are particularly relevant for understanding the transition, both of which involve a tremendous change in notions of the self that have been present in Western societies over the past 100 years. Because early 20th century life in Europe and America was far more regulated than is the case today. And there are several respects in which this can be said to be the case. So at the level of politics and economics, the early 20th century was dominated by a Fordist mode of production, in which workers were guaranteed a job for life with fixed regular hours and a steady income. And all of that was ensured by heavy state regulation of the markets under a Keynesian model. But in the late 20th century, under what's often called the neoliberal or post-Fordist mode of capitalism, the state has retreated, allowing the free market to regulate itself. And the result is that the operations of capitalism have become much more flexible, but also much more uncertain. People work on short-term temporary contracts. Factories hop around from Mexico to Malaysia to Ethiopia, wherever's best for keeping their costs down. Individuals and governments have to work hard in order to prove their own employability or to attract investment capital. And that's precisely one of the reasons why, as we saw earlier, there's so much emphasis on trying to achieve and be a success in today's world. If you don't achieve, if you're not a success, life can quickly become very difficult. And as the welfare state retreats and cedes power to the free market, it's increasingly your own responsibility to get that sorted out. So that was the first factor, these broader shifts in our political economy that place a lot more emphasis on individual responsibility for one's life. On the cultural side, the attachment to family bonds, social norms, community values, religious values, and so forth, all very widespread in the early 20th century, received a serious challenge from the 1960s onwards. The Summer of Love and the hippie counterculture movement overthrew long-standing taboos on sexuality, communal living, deference to authority, and so forth. Feminist movements, gay rights and civil rights movements have all challenged long-standing hierarchies of race, gender and sexuality, liberating individuals to really be themselves and express who they really were. And thank goodness, I would say, this is a very welcome development. But it also comes with a shift from regulation to responsibility. No longer regulated by social norms or convention, instead, everyone now has a kind of responsibility or a pressure to be themselves as much as they possibly can. If they're not, they're letting themselves down. Now, none of this is to say that these forms of deregulation are either good or bad. You can reach your own conclusion on that. I mean, personally, I think there's been a bit too much deregulation of the markets and maybe not quite enough deregulation of social norms. But the point is that whether you see them as good changes or bad changes or neutral, this broad shift from regulation to responsibility has definitely introduced new forms of pressure. Because now there's not so much the pressure to conform with external expectations. I mean, there are a sweeping account, there certainly are for some people, but in general, there's less of a pressure to conform to what other people think is the right way of doing things. But now there's a new kind of pressure, the pressure to be responsible, the pressure to realize one's full potential self. Now, this shift in experiences of individuality and in notions of the self can, I think, really help us to understand why different aspects of dysphoria are standing out as compelling to us versus our predecessors. So in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, for example, where there was such strong emphasis on social codes and social taboos, on obedience and conformity, when the experience of life was one of being acted upon or conforming to the law, rather than being driven by one's own initiative and desires, it makes perfect sense that the feelings that would be most troublesome to people were feelings related to guilt at actual or desired transgressions, of anxiety as to whether or not one would conform, or feelings of deep inner conflict. And these were all forms of distress that were distilled into the diagnostic labels of hysteria and neurasthenia. It was these themes that lay at the heart of Freud's attempt to develop a psychoanalytic method of treatment. These were the themes that preoccupied early 20th century psychiatry. And that's because those were the aspects of dysphoria that stood out to patient and clinician alike, because they spoke to a broader set of cultural concerns. In contemporary times, slightly different themes can be seen as taking centre stage. Transgression, or the expression of one's own personal desires, is no longer quite such a powerful source of anxiety or conflict for many people, because it's what we're frequently being encouraged to do, to be ourselves. The trouble is that having to constantly take responsibility for one's own self, having to constantly be oneself, takes a lot of effort. It's exhausting, and there's always more work to be done. because there's always the risk that the life you live now is inadequate compared to the life that you could lead if only your potential were more fully realized, if only you worked a little bit harder, if only you were a little bit truer to yourself. And so I want to suggest it's not the pressures of conformity, but these broader cultural concerns of responsibility that increasingly lie at the heart of dysphoria today. So think of what marks depression out. The depressed person is someone who has trouble forming projects, who lacks energy, who lacks the motivation to carry projects out. So that's someone who stands in exact opposition to neoliberal social norms. Faced with a constant pressure to succeed, new forms of mental pathology have emerged, which are new, culturally inflected expressions of the dysphoria that all human beings can experience. And at their core is the question of becoming a success, and internal conflicts over whether one can manage it, whether one has managed it, and whether one really wants to try anymore. And of course, the high levels of work and low levels of leisure that are associated with the neoliberal model, the chronic insecurity and precarity and anxiety associated with gig economies and so forth, means that many people are so exhausted that if they do have the underlying predispositions necessary for a dysphoric episode, then the onset of that episode is all the more likely. So in this light, I think we can already see that the contemporary cultural emphasis on success and achievement, on ideals of the American dream, the self-made man, rags to riches success story, they're not all they're cracked up to be. And just by participating in that culture, we risk ending up propagating the social norms and values that can actually be responsible for intense mental suffering. So I think this is an important insight for understanding contemporary mental health and for thinking about ways that we might try and address the causes rather than the symptoms of the problem. Nevertheless, this argument that I've just put forward, and it's not my own argument, it's largely drawn from the French sociologist Alain Ehrenberg, still leaves us with several important but unanswered questions. Because firstly, if depression's a disorder that reflects the difficulty in fulfilling one's potential and the frustration about having to fulfill one's potential, why should actually succeeding serve as a trigger for it? That doesn't seem to make sense. And secondly, the account that I've given is really incredibly sweeping. It's the kind of big picture account, but does it really capture the different experiences of people living in different socioeconomic groups, of different genders, of different races, let alone the experiences of people in parts of the world where the injunction to achieve and succeed is now just as common as it is in Europe and America, but who've got very different historical and cultural and religious and other backgrounds to Europe and America? Well, to answer all of those questions, we need to take a slightly different kind of anthropological approach. So rather than adopting a grand comparative study that draws out general trends in the experiences of the self and produces a grand narrative of humanity, which is one way of doing anthropology, I now want us to think about how these issues play out within much more sharply delineated contexts, taking a deep dive into the lives of particular people and communities. And I think one of the great strengths of anthropology as a research method and as a subject to study at university is its commitment to long-term intensive participant observation through ethnographic fieldwork so that you can really get to know people very, very well and really understand the world from their points of view. And so I'm going to end by turning to a couple of case studies that do exactly that, allowing us to understand the variegated ways in which the dilemmas of being responsible might be experienced, and thereby illuminating how and why success can sometimes be unexpectedly painful. Now, the first case that I want to turn to is a study by the American anthropologist Cynthia Fordham, who you see down there in the corner of the screen. And Cynthia spent years working at an American high school, which she calls Capital High, because it's based in Washington, DC. And Fordham argues that the way Black kids in Capital High mediate their own success is profoundly affected by an enduring legacy of slavery, racial conflict, and ongoing segregation within the social life of the school. So for high-achieving black kids, she argues, academic success is a form of warfare. It's warfare against the expectations of dominant white society, which still expects black kids to do worse. So the kids conform with white standards as a form of resistance against those expectations. But in doing so, they come to be at war with many of their black peers who argue that to preserve black identity and to retain a sense of humanness, they should just completely reject achievement by the parameters of a white-run system. So there's a terrible irony and conflict here. The high-achieving kids are trying to use their achievement as a means of demonstrating or reclaiming their humanness by equaling and outperforming their white peers and saying they are just as good. They deserve recognition for that. But in doing so, they risk being accused of acting white by some of their friends and their family, or becoming a raceless self. So what do? Well, they have to adopt various strategies. Some try to disavow their blackness. Some try to hide their achievement. They might secretly attend advanced classes while they're officially registered for lower sets. But when both the schema of succeeding at blackness, being a kind of a good black adolescent, measured by the standards of friends and family, and the schema of succeeding at schooling and meeting the expectations of school authorities, when those both have such a powerful grip on the kids and are in such tension with each other, their lives, their subjectivities become shot through with self-imposed doubt and friction. Their resistance implodes, Fordham writes, riddling their psyches with self-doubt. And when these students then go on to college from Capital High, they encounter further difficulties. They find that they're being rejected by many of their friends for acting white by going to college, and yet they find they're never taken seriously by the white students at their new university because their admission and their accomplishments are just chalked up to positive discrimination and not taken as legitimate. So all of this puts incredible psychological pressure on the students, which often, understandably, results in dysphoria. But it's a dysphoria marked by a deep sense of directionlessness and ambiguity of identity, which are feelings that are not necessarily shared by other Americans who are experiencing a dysphoric episode. Okay, ambiguity of identity, that wasn't an issue for Tennessee Williams. Why would it have been? So this case very clearly shows how the broader cultural pressures associated with success can take on additional and particularly fraught meanings in the lives of a minoritized group that's still dealing with the legacy of centuries of persecution by the majority. But we'd have never fully understood that without Fordham going into the school, living with these kids for much of their lives, and seeing how deeply these conflicting ideas about reclaiming humanness featured in the lives of the students who studied at Capital High. Now, in the Riau Islands of Indonesia, which is where I've done fieldwork for the past 16 years or so, a slightly different set of problems can beset people who do well. Because this is an area that's long been imagined to be a complete backwater. It's spoken of as the kind of place that produces low-quality human resources. And so the government has tried staging large numbers of public contests and competitions to reassure people that they really are achievers and to motivate them to strive for ever greater things. And here you see two of my friends who did quite well in an English language competition. They've got big trophies to show for it. But the problem is that people like this, people who succeed, struggle to believe that they really are as exceptional as they've been told they are. And there are two reasons for that. Firstly, they think that politicians are just saying that they're high quality for their own purposes, because if you say, well, we've got great high quality human resources in our province, it makes it look like the politicians are doing a good job. So they don't trust the sincerity of the recognition. But secondly, most Indonesians that I met didn't believe that talent was an individual capacity, or at least not wholly an individual capacity. They spoke of it as being grown. inculcated through the relations they had with parents, religious leaders, school teachers, school facilities, and so on. So talent was created by these relations. But the problem is, when you live in a backwater where everyone around you is a low-quality human resource, your talent probably hasn't been created very well. So this distinctive understanding of the self as having talent created by others had a couple of consequences for local kids' mental health. It meant that the people who succeeded and were sent off for special seminars in Jakarta or Singapore were crippled with devastating levels of anxiety. They were convinced that they were frauds, imposters who were going to be found out, and for some that proved incredibly debilitating. But it also meant that although this was somewhere where everybody wanted to be a success, there wasn't so much of a sense that they were solely and uniquely responsible for that. Rather, it was the state and wider society that was responsible, because that was what created them. And that sensibility, I think, had implications for the way in which dysphoria was expressed. It was relatively rare for people to complain of sluggishness or exhaustion or a lack of motivation as symptoms of a mental illness. Instead, people spoke of being filled with a deep sadness and anger at the world, anger at the society that had deprived them of the means of being a success that they so aspired to be. And so the tonality of the dysphoria was a little bit different to that which might be seen in some other contexts. It had more of a sense of externalized rage rather than internal self-loathing or self-blame. Now, whether or not any of these concerns that I've traced in the two cases were the issues that triggered Tennessee Williams' breakdown, the case with which we opened, is ultimately something that we can never know for sure. But personally, I think a clue to his own problems comes from his fear that the people around him no longer related to him sincerely. And I think it's quite interesting that he cured his neurasthenic episode by faking an eye operation, because when he had all the bandages, it looked like he'd had this terrible operation and he could have lost his sight. Suddenly people started treating him kindly once again, or at least that's his experience. And so it's quite a melodramatic way of resolving the issue, but it does fit with quite a lot of comparative anthropological findings, which suggests that success and the forms of ranking and differentiation that it generates are often very toxic to horizontal bonds of friendship. So in many British schools, for example, successful pupils get bullied for their talents. In Kenya, high achievers are so afraid that they'll become victims of witchcraft that they hide or give away their school prizes. They don't want to be seen as someone who's better than the group. But that's not the only way in which these relations might play out. So to go back to the Indonesian example, there a high-achieving person might become very popular because they become a resource that can help grow you and assist you and help improve your own capacity to achieve. So it's not intrinsic to success that it dissolves relationships, but rather it fits with broader social ideas about ranking, differentiation, class consciousness, competitiveness, and so on. So what conclusions can we draw? Well, I think we've seen from our little discussion, our tour of different parts of the world, that quite different ideas of the ideal self exist in different parts of the world. And that's partly because of cultural difference, but it's also because of different historical, political, and economic factors that make those visions of the self especially appealing. And so it really is important to note the limits of just chalking everything up to culture. Often there's a reason why cultures have become as they are. That's not always, but often in some ways linked to political and economic dynamics. And this is why thinking about the realm of the political and the economic and all the things you get a great grounding for if you apply for the LSE anthropology course, that becomes really important for understanding things that feel kind of not particularly political or economic, like mental health. So we've got these different ideas of the self, but as well as being appealing for particular reasons, they all carry their own distinct pressure points. Now, those pressure points can determine what sorts of issues are likely to trigger a mental disorder. Some triggers we know seem to be pretty much universal, so bereavement, loss of a close relative, often triggers dysphoric episodes in all parts of the world, understandably. But then there are others that seem to be a little bit more contextually specific. And it's interesting to see how issues related to success and failure are increasingly becoming triggers as this more insecure neoliberal form of economic organisation becomes more widespread. What's also interesting is that the particular pressure points associated with different ideas of the self come to affect the ways in which dysphoria is experienced and described. And so it does seem that these broad cultural ideas, these meanings, these ideals feed into our mental health in very important and very fundamental ways. Now that raises the question, as you know, if anthropology can provide this kind of commentary and explanation as to what's going on, can anthropology actually do anything to help? And here I think the answer has to be yes and no. Maybe it's a little bit pessimistic, but I do think that human beings, wherever they live, are always going to be at risk of dysphoria. I think that's part of the human condition. And you can't live in a society without some kind of notion of the self or some mode of social organisation that is going to carry its own pressure points that will put certain people in certain circumstances at heightened risk of dysphoria. So you can debate the different merits of forms of social organisation. Some might be generally better than others. Some might put one group at risk, others might put another group at risk. I don't think we can escape the danger completely. But at the same time, when so many people in our contemporary world are consumed by these deep personal feelings of inadequacy, or worries about whether they're living up to their potential, and this is something that I see with my own students all the time, I think it is helpful to remember that these feelings are not necessarily as natural or as inevitable as they may seem, to recognise that the kinds of feelings that one has aren't just about personal issues or personal inadequacies, but it speaks more broadly to the organisation of the world around us. Now, through that kind of critical analysis, what we can do is we can reveal how situations that are aiming to help people by encouraging them to succeed, whether that be a kind of gifted and talented programme or the publication of a self-help book, might actually be inadvertently pressurizing. They might become complicit with this responsibilization of the self. And we can think of ways in which we might be able to encourage healthier ways of relating to achievement. And that could happen at both a micro and a macro level. So at a micro level, it might be about ensuring that in a school, for example, achievement is not the be-all and end-all of a student's worth, even if they're on a gifted and talented programme. At a macro level, it might be about reforms to the welfare system, to benefits and so forth, so that if you, for whatever reason, are deemed someone who's not a success, that's not the end of the line. It's not a death sentence, that actually there are ways in which your own value is recognised and can flourish within the way that our society is set up. So there are ways in which I think this kind of analysis can inspire activist interventions. And what we can also do is pay close attention to the ways in which these dynamics that I've been talking about affect different groups in different ways, so that we can avoid the perpetuation of historic injustices, and we can also avoid the production of new ones. So I hope this has given you some food for thought. I hope it might even resonate with some of your own experiences and anxieties. One of the reasons that I wanted to talk on this for London Anthropology Day is because, as I say, I recognise these anxieties about success and potential as very common issues for students that I teach, people that I know, and I think thinking about it anthropologically and viewing it in the bigger sense can possibly open up some kind of critical purchase for managing those feelings and putting them in context and thinking about alternative ways of seeing the world. So I hope that has proven interesting or relevant to some of you. If you'd like to read more in an academic sense, here are some of the readings that I've been drawing on in my discussion, or that would allow you to follow up on these issues and explore them a little bit more deeply and more richly. And if any of you do have any questions, sadly, we don't have a Q&A session now because it's all pre-recorded, but do feel free to drop me an email, or you can come along to the LSE drop-in session and have a chat with me there. So I think all that remains to be said is thank you so much for listening, and enjoy the rest of London Anthropology Day. Thank you.